In this video, I want to talk about verbal roots and stems, and this is really kind of the heartbeat of chapter 20. We're not going to learn any new tense in chapter 20, but what we cover in chapter 20 are different ways that different verbs can change to reflect different tenses. And this is really true of what we call irregular verbs, and every language has irregular verbs. And so they're just going to take a different form than what we see with regular verbs, which are reflected in Luo. So in the next few slides, we'll work through some of these different forms. The first form that we see are what we call liquid futures. And we call these liquid futures because the stem ends in a liquid. And so we'll talk about liquids in a minute. But with liquid futures, basically it's the future active tense stem, which is going to be your second principal part. The tense formative for liquid futures is going to be epsilon sigma. And then we're going to have the connecting vowel. And then we're going to have our primary active personal endings. And so what happens with the tense formative with the connecting vowel is we have this, what we call an intervocalic sigma, and the sigma drops out. And then we have the epsilon coming up against the connecting vowel. They're going to contract just like what we see with contract vowels. And so in the future is going to look just like our contract verbs. And so min es amen is going to turn into min amen. And the indicator that you're dealing with a liquid future is the circumflex. And so whenever you see a circumflex, that should be an indicator that you're dealing with some type of contract. These are our liquid verbs, our liquid letters, I should say. And so these are, if you have one of these letters, a lambda, a mu, a nu, or a rho at the end of the stem, then you're dealing with a liquid future. Now we call these liquids because they're letters that just don't stop. And so when you pronounce the lambda, for example, there's nothing innate within the letter itself that requires you to stop. So you can't really tell, but this is kind of a gear shifter. And so when you think about a gear shifter, it's l, and so when you pronounce those letters, lambda, mu, nu, rho, they don't stop, and that's what makes them a liquid. So when you have one of these letters at the end of the stem, you're dealing with a liquid future. So the real difficulty with liquid verbs are distinguishing the present tense from the future tense. And so when we look at the present tense of minnow, and minnow means I abide or I remain, we pretty straightforward paradigm if you know Luo. So minnow, mines, mine, min amen, minete, min usen. I remain, you remain, he, she, or it remains, we remain, y'all remain, they remain. So no big surprise there if you know the Luo pattern, Luo, lues, lue, lu omen, lo ete, lu usen. Minnow, mines, mine, min omen, minete, min usen. What becomes problematic is the future. And so the future active looks just like the present active. The only difference is that we have the circumflex, which indicates that we have that contraction going on with the tense formative and the connecting vowel. And so minno, mines, mine, min umen, min ete, min usen. And so a little bit of difference with the first person plural and the second person plural. But for all practical purposes, minnow in the present tense is identical to minnow in the future tense. And so in the text, the only indicator that you have that tells you that you're dealing with the present tense versus the future tense is that circumflex, which tells you that there's a contraction going on. Now for quizzes and exams, if I were to ask you, for example, to write out the paradigm, the future form of minnow, I wouldn't expect you to add the accent. But in terms of reading or parsing, you need to be able to recognize that that circumflex tells you that there's a contraction there and then you're dealing with the future. And so minnow, mines, mine, min umen, minete, minusen, it's the present form. Minnow, minnace, minne, min umen, min ete, min usin is the future form. So not a lot of difference there. The other issue that we have to think about with liquid verbs are present contracts. Because with present contract verbs, we get the circumflex, which tells us that we're dealing with a contract. So here's poieo, which is I do or I make. And we get that epsilon there coming up against the connecting vowel, and we get the contraction. So poieo, the present active indicative form, is poio, poies, poie, poiumen, poiete, poiusin. And it's difficult to distinguish that from a liquid future because we have the circumflex. So minne, minnace, minne, min umen, min ete, min usin. And this is where you just need to recognize that with contract verbs, the contract is there because we have the vowel at the end of the stem. It's contracting with the connecting vowel. So we're going to get the contraction in the present tense. And with liquid futures, we have that epsilon sigma, the sigma dropping out, and the epsilon coming up against the consonant, the connecting vowel. And so the future is going to contract. And so you need to know when you see this contraction, which is indicated with the circumflex, why it's contracting, whether or not it's because it's a contract verb or whether or not it's a liquid verb. And if it's a liquid verb, it's future. If it's a contract verb, it's present. And so just kind of an indicator of what you have here. When we talk about other irregular verbs, we need to talk about principal parts. And in Greek, there are 6 principal parts. And in Mounce introduces this idea in his textbook 19, chapter 19, section 16, so 19.16 on page 202. And most verbs are going to have 6 principal parts, and this is the principal part summary for luo. And so our first principal part is luo, and based on the first principal part, we get our present active and our present middle passive, which are paradigms that you've already learned, but also the imperfect active and the imperfect middle passive are based off this first principal part. Our second principal part is our future active and our future middle, which you've learned already. The third principal part is our aorist active and our aorist middle, which we'll learn later. Our fourth principal part is the perfect active. And then the fifth principal part is our perfect middle passive. And then our sixth principal part is the stem based upon which our aorist passive and our future passive are formed. And so not a whole lot of difference with luo. Luo, the stem never changes. And so you can tell in each principal part we have the stem lambda upsilon. Now you might have a prefix or a suffix which kind of tells you something about the tense itself, but the stem never changes. And so luo is a regular verb. And so all of our regular verbs are going to function just like luo. And so you may not, you don't need to learn the principal parts for luo because you know them. I mean, they're all lu. But for irregular verbs, the stems are going to change. And so you need to start to recognize those stem changes when you come across them. And this is what we refer to as the principal parts. One other part of the Mounce textbook I want to point out is on page 450. And on page 450, we have about 10 pages of verbs and their principal parts. And Mounce doesn't label them, but the first column is going to be our present active. The second column is going to be our future active, future middle. The third column is going to be our aorist active, aorist middle. Our fourth column is going to be our perfect active. The fifth column is going to be our perfect middle passive. And then the last column is going to be our aorist passive, and the stem is also formed on the future passive as well. So it's important to really begin to think about these principal parts. Now, when we think about the verb root is the most basic form of the verb. And so we'll look at a few verb roots. And so the root is what is in common between the present, the future, and the aorist. And so the most basic form of the verb in a particular tense is the principal part. And so what does that look like? For luo, our present tense is going to be luo, our future tense is going to be luso, and our aorist tense is going to be elusa. So the present stem is lu, the future stem is lu, and then the aorist stem is lu. And so the verbal root, which is the most common element of the present, future, and aorist, is simply lu. So no major change. This is what Mounce calls his pattern 1, where the root is not modified at all. So what is the stem? The stem is the most basic form of a verb in a particular tense. And so the part that doesn't change. And so, for example, we have lu amen. And so when we change it to the future, we're going to remove the extras, and we're going to get lu sete. And so our P, future active indicative, we get that sigma. So the stem is that part of the verb that just never changes. And so to find the stem, you just remove the extras. A verb like balo, and balo means I throw. And the mnemonic device I use for balo are what's the thing that you throw? Well, it's a ball. And so balo means I throw. And so our present active indicative form is balo. Our future form, remember, this is a liquid. And so at the end of our stem, we have the l. And so this is a liquid. So it's balo, and we get the circumflex. And then our aorist form is balon. And so the stem for our present tense stem is ball with 2 lambdas. The future tense stem is ball with 1 lambda. And then our aorist tense stem is ball with 1 lambda. And so our verb root is ball with 1 lambda. And so it's the part of the word that is common between all of our tenses. And so this is a good example of a verb that's irregular, but not so irregular. And then we have verbs that are completely irregular, where we have different stems, like Lego. And so our present tense stem is Lego. Our future tense is arrow. Now, this is an interesting form because in the future tense, the stem is epsilon rho, and rho is a liquid, so and so in the future form, it's going to be a liquid future, even though it's not a liquid verb per se. And then the aorist stem tense stem is apen, which is a word that you've already memorized as a part of the vocabulary. He, she, or it said. And so the stem for the present tense is leg. The stem, the future stem is er. And the aorist stem is ep, or fit. And so this is one where the verb root changes. And so particularly irregular verb. And so something to be mindful of as you think through this. And so patterns of changes. And so the principal part sometimes undergoes some changes from the verbal root to the formation of the verb. And so some patterns of changes that we can recognize. So the first pattern of change is that there's no change at all. And most verbs are like this. These are our regular verbs. The other pattern of change is where we could have a stem change, like what we saw with balo. And then the third pattern of change is where we have completely different verb roots, like Lego. And so the present tense stem is leg, the future is er, and the aorist stem is ep. And so here's some examples of verbs that have no change. And so luo, the future form becomes luso. Akuo, the present tense, becomes akuso, the future tense. Blepo, well, the future form of blepo, which is ic, becomes blepso, and so we get a psi there. Well, that's just because the sigma is coming up against the p, and so we kind of get a contraction there with the square stops. So really no change there, though you just need to be mindful that that sigma coming up against the p, we get the psi. Same thing with agapao. There's no real change here. It's just the sigma coming up against the alpha, and we get that elongation. So agapao is our present tense. Agapeso is our future tense. Poieo is our present tense. Poieso is our future tense. And then our third contract verb here, plerao, becomes pleroso. So no change here. It's just the sigma sometimes can stand on its own or else create some type of contraction. We can have some stem changes where the stem shifts, and so some examples might be roots ending in a stop, and so baptizo is our future form, means I baptize, but our future form is baptizo. And so really the stem, the verbal root is baptid, and so we get that stop there. And so the baptizo is our present tense, and baptizo is our future tense. Our double sigma, tauraso, well, the future form is tauraxo. Some other examples with double consonants. So balo, well, our future form becomes balo with one lambda. Or there might be letters added, like with the iota. And so airo, which means I take up, the future form, we lose that iota, so it becomes aro. And then verbs that end in isco, we have apathenesco, so we have that iota subscript. The future form becomes apathanomai. Or gnosco, we lose that iota, nosomai. And so kind of interesting changes to the stem. And so really what you need to know, some of these verbs are patterns of how other verbs might shift, but you really just need to know your principal parts. And if you can recognize those principal parts for some of these irregular verbs, you'll know what tense you're dealing with. And then our third pattern of change is different roots. And so erkamai is our present tense form, while our future tense form is elusamai. Lego is our present tense form. Arrow is our future tense. Orao becomes opsomai. And so you just have to memorize these verbs and be able to recognize the principal parts for each of these. And these are our nasty 9. I call these the nasty 9 because they're 9 verbs where the principal parts come from different verb roots. And but only 6 of these occur more than 50 times, and one, areo, only occurs 3 times. And so you may want to consider the first 6, maybe the first 7, as you think through these. Lego occurs quite a bit. Lego means I say. Erkamai means I come. Oira means I know. So these 3 verbs you're going to see quite a bit. Estheo means I eat. Orao means I see. Pharaoh means I carry. And then pasco means I suffer. And then treco and areo are more of our verbs that don't occur very often. But of these 9 verbs, these are going to be verbs where the roots are completely different. Now, when you think about our irregular verbs, we have really 2 sets of irregular verbs. We've looked at 3 types of verbs. Verbs where there's no change. These are going to be like luo, agapao, akuo. We have verbs where the stem shifts a little bit. And then we have this third pattern where it's a completely different verbal root. So, of our 2 types of irregular verbs, those where the stem shifts a little bit and where we have completely different verbal roots, I find that our irregular verbs are a little bit easier to recognize because they're so vastly different. You can almost recognize that, oh, apen, that's I said, that's the aorist form. But when these verbs that where the stem shifts, that's where the changes become a little bit more subtle, and you have to think through what's going on in the verb a little bit more. So that's it for chapter 20, and I look forward to seeing you in class.